Today I'm going to talk about the paper that I wrote for the workshop, Trading Carbon Offsets, Human Rights, and Environmental Regulation. And it's kind of fitting based on some of the discussions we were having yesterday about the environment, where that fits into all of these kinds of discussions. And as I was driving over here this morning, I heard on the radio a clip from Stephen Harper's speech at the convention out in Alberta yesterday, where he said we cannot have environmental protection at the expense of economic growth. And I think that's a really important thing to think about when we start thinking about things like carbon trading, carbon offsetting, because that's from where carbon trading comes, the logic that one can't come at the expense of the other, whereas many would argue that we're going to have to take some hits or something's got to change. And the idea here is that things don't necessarily need to change. We can have our cake and eat it too. So what I want to do today is take a look at carbon offsetting in particular and just provide a little bit of context before I get into the meat of the paper and what it was that I was attempting to do in this paper. So for those not familiar with the global carbon offsetting market or markets, there's two main markets that we need to understand. One comes through the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, and that is the compliance global carbon market, whereby entities, particularly in the global north that have commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, they can buy carbon offsets from countries in the global south that undertake emission reducing or emission eliminating projects. So basically, instead of making the reductions at the source, because it's often considered too costly, you can purchase offsets and put them toward your emission reduction commitments. Obviously, there's lots of critiques environmentally there because, is that really reducing your emissions? Anyways, that's another discussion. It is a legally binding framework. On the other hand, you have the voluntary market in carbon offsets, which is just that. It's voluntary. It's a market that has basically been growing over the last so many years. And purchasers choose to purchase offsets. 90% of the purchasers are corporate entities that are trying to meet corporate social responsibility or leadership, industry leadership targets. And so they, same idea, you purchase offsets from projects in the global south or the north, but lots of them come from the south. And it is not legally binding. So the legally versus non-legally binding becomes important for what it is I'm looking at in this paper. So what I kind of wanted to do was to engage in a discussion that's happening in the academic literature, but also a mainstream discussion that's happening amongst observers of carbon offsetting. And basically people are identifying the fact that we're getting somewhat divergent trajectories within these two markets. So in the compliance market, in the CDM, for example, we're seeing a much higher incidence of human rights and social abuses that are coming alongside projects. So I won't get into all of them here, but in the paper, I list out a number of them. So in 2011, the CDM Executive Board approved the registration of the Honduran Agua Biogas Recovery Palm Oil Project, despite the public availability of evidence documenting the assassination of 23 peasant farmers between March 2010 and February 2011 who maintain legitimate claim to the land. And the executive board knew about this, and they said it's not within our mandate to rule on those things. We're measuring it on the environmental integrity of the project. In Panama, the CDM has approved the Barrio Blanco Dam on the Tabasara River, and it's currently slated to displace indigenous groups living in the area who were not consulted on the project. And it's the UNDP did a fact-finding mission, found out that their way of life will fundamentally be undermined and altered. And I could go on and talk about lots of other examples. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But so you've got this going on in the compliance market, and then on the voluntary market, a lot of observers anyways, and in both academic literature and mainstream literature, are talking about something that's happening there which they refer to as the co or side benefits that come alongside projects. So they're talking about carbon plus. You get carbon mitigation in addition to health benefits or gender empowerment or adaptation, biodiversity conservation. So the typical example you hear is of clean cook stoves, whereby because people are no longer cutting down trees or biomass to cook in their household, they're not contributing to global warming. At the same time, then the smoke that's produced in the household is not nearly as toxic and contributing to the death and illness of many people who cook in the household. And gender empowerment because women are spending less time collecting fuel wood, for example. So this is happening, and a lot of people are celebrating the co-benefits that are coming in the voluntary market that seem to be missing in the compliance market. So what I wanted to do in the paper was to kind of take a two-pronged approach. One was pragmatic, and that was to do a theoretical, empirical, and comparative analysis of offsetting between these two markets for the purposes of a policy dialogue, because like it or not, and I will be honest, I don't like it, but it's going to continue to happen, and as countries are negotiating the next global agreement for climate change to follow whenever that comes, offsetting is going to be central to that agreement. So there's a policy discussion that needs to happen. At the same time, I think if we leave it at that level, we threaten to render technical or depoliticize what is a highly political and power-laden issue, and that's global warming, and then the kinds of solutions that we're coming up to deal with it, if we can call them solutions. So part two is then a theoretical interrogation of offsetting with an emphasis on the voluntary market as a neoliberal response to climate change mitigation in order to examine its implications for both development and achieving mitigation. So I don't have a lot of time to get into all of this, but basically in the academic literature, various people are pointing out, and we've got Bumpus and Lieberman and Lovell and Lieberman here, they're doing work on comparing offsetting markets, saying we can't understand all offsetting as just offsetting, but we need to understand these markets differently. And they say in order to do so, we need to understand carbon's materiality, its technologies of governance, and the techniques of implementation. So I'll explain what that means. But at the heart of carbon trading and carbon offsetting is this process of commensuration. You basically, in order to have fungible credit that can be traded within a system, you have to go through this process of commensuration to make a ton. So if a ton's being reduced through a project in China, it has to be equal to an emission being emitted in Germany, where the offset's being purchased. And if you don't do that, the argument is obviously there's no environmental integrity. If you can't have a complex accounting process through which you equate one to the other. In addition to that, a market obviously needs a liquid and tradable commodity. So that's how we get there. So that's a very complicated process, which I could talk lots about, but there's not a lot of time here. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but basically there's this concept from Bumpus around hemming. And the idea that hemming refers to the process by which a ton of CO2 is enclosed and rendered calculable as an effect of the process or technology through which it was produced. So the greater the number of variables in the process of hemming, the more difficult it is to commensurate. So what we get here then, and this is key to understanding these different trajectories in these markets, is that carbon's materiality. If you have methane coming from a landfill project, and I cite a landfill project in South Africa where the people living around it, it's a toxic or a cancer hotspot. Toxins are leaching into the water, into the soil. People are terribly sick, and the CDM is funding it as an offsetting project because they're capturing the methane. This is a huge problem, but it's very easy to measure how much methane is being captured. The technology's there. It's quite simple. You can do it at the source. It's site-specific. Things like cook stoves, on the other hand, well, you're going to a household and saying, how much biomass have you cut down in the last year or the last 2 years? Very imprecise. What's the vegetation like in the different areas that you cut down? What's the weather patterns? What have the weather patterns been over the last, 2 years? How are all of these things changing? Are people continuing to use the technology after they get it? Is it culturally appropriate? All of these different variables mean it's almost impossible to hem in and figure out how much carbon's being reduced through a cook stove or a water filtration project or these kinds of things. So what happens, and this is where the legally binding versus non-legally binding becomes important in terms of the governance structure. If you are a compliance entity and you have to meet your targets and say, yes, I legally met my targets, then you're going to go for what's easiest. And so guess what? A coal-fired power plant in India or China is much easier. The CDM funds them, even though there's lots of problems with coal, obviously, and the communities that live around these projects. But it's very easy to figure out how much carbon you capped out of the atmosphere. Whereas these other projects with the side benefits, it's much more difficult to figure out. So the argument is, this is why we're kind of seeing this. There's much more flexibility in the voluntary market because it's voluntary. You're not saying I had to do it legally. So you can do these other kinds of projects. So this has led to an obsession with calculation, according to Lovell and Lieberman, in the CDM, for the purposes of commensuration and compliance with the legal requirements of the Kyoto Protocol. And this crowds out. My argument is not that the CDM is saying, hey, let's go abuse human rights. It's just that's not part of what is going on with the CDM. So it crowds out those other things. The voluntary market, on the other hand, given its governance structure, has more room for non-cooperative carbon, the stuff that's much more difficult to hem in. So we get more co-or-side benefits from some of their projects. So household distribution devices, cook stoves, water filters, and so on, saw an 80% increase in transacted tons of CO2 from 2011 to 2012. The value in this market doubled between the same time. And I mean, this is being celebrated, that we've got this market doing very wonderful kinds of things. And so you can read all of the different documents that are coming out saying, you know, we must embrace this. So what are my conclusions from that on the pragmatic side? Well, I think, yes, we can learn a few things. And I argue that we need, obviously, and it probably goes without saying, the increased use of mandatory social and environmental impact assessments in the CDM. And this is less an additive tool for promoting so-called co-benefits than it would function as a restrictive tool for limiting the worst abuses. And basically, I argue that the problem of commensuration and getting fungible carbon is not going to disappear. There's still an imperative to go for what's easiest. So you need to restrict then what can happen within that context. But I don't think they're going to go further than that. So then here are those where I shift to the second part of the paper, and I say that, you know, we're missing a lot if we stop with the policy dialogue. And some of my other work has analyzed what's going on in the broader carbon market. And I argue that what's missing is capital imperatives. We're not really talking about the imperatives of capital and how it shapes those markets. So as a market-based instrument, carbon offsetting responds ultimately to the profit motive and profit potential embedded in offsetting initiatives, leaving both markets highly vulnerable to the imperatives of capital. So if we look specifically at the voluntary market, and this is where I think we need to interrogate what's going on rather than the rush to embrace. And some of the scholars I cite, they're not rushing to embrace, but the much more popular literature certainly is. I draw on some different examples, and I basically say that the voluntary market further entrenches development's reconceptualization as a market good available according to one's purchasing power. And so this kind of ties into the presentation on fair trade bananas that we had from Mark yesterday. So a few things we can talk about. Clean cook stoves. 2% of stoves are given away, with the remaining 98% requiring buy-in from typically poor and marginalized end users. This can be up to $140. And basically the idea is that for-profit entities aren't going to do it if there's not a return on your investment. It's not worth it. Collapsing carbon prices, and I can talk about that broader crisis in the carbon market and the CDM, has hollowed up upfront carbon finance and investment that goes into financing projects at the beginning. So what's happened is that these for-profit developers have transferred costs onto poor end users, or they're encouraging them to take out microfinance. And with microfinance, which is very problematic in many ways, we also know that, you know, for those who still embrace it, they argue that it helps you start up a business so there's a return so you can pay back your loan. Well, if you're buying your own development so you can cook or you can drink clean water, where's the return on your investment? So we get these cycles of indebtedness that become possible through this because you're purchasing your own development and the state is withdrawing from that responsibility. Investment as well is heavily dependent on the CSR targets of corporate entities who are driven by corporate sustainability. So it's not so much sustainability of the planet or people necessarily, as it is corporate sustainability in terms of your targets. So that can change. So they're not necessarily committed to the people with which they are engaging. So I argue that we have to think of the broader implications for the role of the state in development, obviously. And I just have one example to kind of wrap things up here as well. If we are to switch to look at the questions around mitigation and offsetting in the voluntary market, I just want to highlight this new methodology that's being used increasingly, and it's called the suppressed demand methodology. And it's basically intended to get more investment into poorer regions that haven't been able to access global carbon markets because investors see it as, too risky, there's not enough return. So suppressed demand, there's a project called the the LifeStraw Water Filter Project, which is run by Vestergaard Franston Inc., which is a Swiss company. They distributed 877,000 water filters to be used in the household for a 10-year voluntary offset project, and they gave them to 90% of the population. There was a $30 million equity investment from the company itself, and studies then, so I'm going to wrap it up, studies indicated that 20 to 30% of the population boiled their water, but the suppressed demand methodology allowed the company to earn credits for those not boiling water, saying that if they would, they could. So let's make sure we cover them now so that they won't do it in the future if they have the option to do it. Meaning they're not actually reducing any carbon within that context. The key here is that the company's not going to invest $30 million of its own equity if there's not the promise of a return on investment. And the only way you're going to earn up to $300 million over 10 years is by giving credits for something that doesn't actually exist. This doesn't exist. So these are the kinds of things that we're now seeing being rolled out, and the CDM is doing it as well, and everybody's embracing it. So I conclude then that carbon trading and carbon markets typify a classic problem-solving approach, drawing on Cox's work, to global warming mitigation, whereby existing relations of production and power are taken as given, and the threat posed by ecological crisis is reinterpreted and addressed according to the specific imperatives underpinning these relations. This has led to nested mitigation strategies that minimize or eliminate the threats posed to accumulation by climate change policy. And the result is that capital imperatives necessarily are trumping those of mitigation or meaningful development. So we really need to rethink here, and we need to be careful about the wonderful things we're hearing about some parts of the market and not others. That's it.